r/Nosleep, posted by Reddit user RichardSaxon. If the sky goes dark in the middle of the day, hide. Part 2. Self-preservation might not be my most redeeming quality, so when I saw a figure walking around in the overwhelming darkness, my first instinct was to help them. The fact, mixed with the skull-crushing headache I'd received as a parting gift from the alcohol, caused me to fuck up momentarily enough to call out to the dark. There, on the streets, hundreds of dark figures approached me, mere shadows with humanoid faces, barely resembling people. While they hadn't necessarily seen me, they definitely heard me idiotically call out through the window. I ducked down out of sight and closed the blinds. I contemplated whether I should leave the light off to keep myself hidden, or to turn it on to fight the darkness. Then I noticed a few scribbles on a piece of paper, posted underneath the light switch. Leave on. I turned on every switch I could, hoping I could repel the bizarre creatures from entering my temporary home. Then, after I locked all doors and windows, I collected my mobile phone, my gun, and the provided flashlight before boarding myself up inside the pantry. With little hesitation, I decided to call Sheriff again, hoping he would give me some further instructions on how to survive the oncoming nightmare. Alas, despite my best efforts, the call wouldn't go through. I glanced down at my service weapon and considered whether hiding or escape would be my best option. But even if bullets could maim the creatures, I wouldn't have nearly enough ammunition to put a dent in the horde. My only option would be to hide until the darkness receded. The driver had told me earlier that only a couple of hours would pass while the darkness loomed over us, and while I prayed that it was true, something within me felt indistinctly doubtful. I kept quiet as I could, keeping my eyes fixed on the door in front of me, and my hand on the gun. While I couldn't hear the creatures move around, I knew they had gotten close once the lights outside the pantry started to dim. It wasn't as if the lights died, but more like their presence swallowed the light. The silver light that sneaked under the door had all but vanished, and I had little more than a weak light bulb inside the pantry, and my exceptionally strong flashlight left to keep me company. Hours passed, and I held my breath as I awaited what felt like inevitable demise. Then days passed, and the darkness remained. I tried my best to preserve the battery on my phone, only turning it on every few hours to check the time, and attempting to call for backup. I managed to keep the phone going for a week before it eventually died. Even if I had a charger with me, there were no outlets to connect to. The pantry itself had become a disgusting prison. Food and water wasn't exactly a scarce resource, but dealing with my bathroom habits made me weigh the pros and cons of consuming anything more than absolute necessities. Time became a foreign concept without my phone to keep track of it. I had to rely on my own internal clock, which had been wrecked by the lack of day and night cycle. Based on the growth of my beard, I assumed 2 weeks had passed by the time I looked at my gun as more of a way out than a means of self-defense. By then, the light outside my door had completely vanished. It had taken the creatures a long time to consume all the light, but once they were done, I could see slivers of shadow penetrate from under the door. I shined my light at it, which seemed to keep them at bay, but I only had so much battery power, including the extra batteries left in the pantry. Day by day, my sanity started to fade. Every thought was occupied by the immense desire to escape, be it through heroic act of defiance or by a bullet in my own head. Then, as if a switch had been flicked, a beam of bright light appeared under the door. A heavenly, white light, brighter and more beautiful than anything I'd ever seen. I stared at it in disbelief. Could it be daylight? I didn't know, and I didn't even dare open the door. I must have sat there for an hour before a familiar voice finally broke my trance. "Robert, are you in there?" I heard the sheriff call out. I carefully started dismantling the makeshift barricade I'd placed in front of the door and stumbled out into the bright hall of my home. The light of day hit me with a blinding power. "Well, thank God you're still here. I thought we lost you for sure," Sheriff Riley exclaimed as I opened the door. I just stared at him for a moment before I fully believed he was real. What happened?" I stuttered. Robert tried to hold back a grimace as he noticed the smell and sate of my worn-out body. He stepped inside and closed the door to keep me out of sight. I caught a brief glance at my own reflection in the window. Greasy hair, untrimmed beard, and bloodshot eyes. "How long was I in there?" I asked. 19 days. It's the longest we've ever." He trailed off as he noticed the look of dread on my face. "I'm sorry, Robert." I reeked of sweat and shit after being trapped in my own filth for almost 3 weeks. The sheriff seemed slightly fresher than myself, probably having access to a bathroom. It wasn't his fault that I'd been trapped in the pantry. If I hadn't called out to the creatures, I could have stayed safely inside my own home and lived isolated but comfortable life. I had a lot of questions, but in my tired state all I could think of was to clean myself up. "I'm gonna have a shower," I said. He nodded understandingly and said he'd wait for me while I got ready. As I washed the past 3 weeks off my body, I finally started to formulate a plan. I had been so preoccupied with surviving that I hadn't been able to question the reality of the situation. I decided the best course of action would be to call headquarters back in the city. I was out of my depth and needed serious reinforcement. When I got out of the bathroom, I saw Riley talking on the radio with a distraught expression on his face. "What's wrong?" "I just got word from others. We've lost some people. The others are out looking, but the situation seems pretty bleak," he said. "How many?" "I don't know. Current count is 24. Jesus Christ. The longest bout of darkness only lasted a couple of days. And that was almost 30 years ago. This... His words got stuck in his throat. Though he had fared far better than myself in hiding, the people that had been taking were his own. Friends, family, that he'd known his whole life, and it had taken a toll on him. A surge of pity filled my body as I realized the true gravity of the situation. "Sheriff Riley, we're going to figure this out, I promise. We just need help from the city to let people know what's going on here." He nodded. "You're right. But what are we going to tell them?" "The truth." I charged my phone and attempted to call my supervisor. He was a good, albeit skeptical person. But even he couldn't reject a call for help with several dozen people missing. The phone wouldn't even ring. Not a single bar of signal was visible on my little screen. By all accounts, we'd effectively been cut off from civilization. I ran through a few ideas, ready to suggest that we just drive the town over. But before I could formulate a proper plan, someone called Riley over the radio. "Sheriff, you there?" a voice said on the other end. He picked it up and responded. "James, yeah, I'm here. What's going on?" "We found something at the edge of town. We don't know," the officer said with a shaky voice. "Oh, God." "What'd you find?" "There's a wall of darkness. It just took Lewis. We need to get out of..." He continued before getting cut off. "James, can you hear me?" Riley kept repeating, getting no response from the other end. He turned towards me with terror in his eyes. "We have to help them." We rushed to the car and started speeding towards the border, only stopping briefly at the station to see if anyone had gotten back. But apart from a prison guard, too old to partake in the search and rescue operation, it was seemingly abandoned. The streets were empty, everyone hiding in their homes while the police did their search. Yet, despite every available officer being on duty, we couldn't reach any of them over the radio. "Those creatures, what are they?" I asked as we sped down the road. Riley glanced over with a look of confusion on his face. "What creatures?" "I saw shadows wandering through the dark, just barely resembling humans. There were hundreds of them." Before I could ask any further questions, a car came speeding towards us from the opposite direction. Riley swerved to the side, narrowly avoiding a collision, while the other car broke violently, skidding into a ditch. A panicked man stumbled out of the car, his face bruised from the crash. "James, what the fuck are you doing?" Riley asked. "They're dead. They're all dead. And I just left them there. I'm sorry. I couldn't. I couldn't," he stuttered as he frantically looked around. I stared toward the horizon from where James had fled. The light at the horizon seemed to cut off, fading harshly from day to night as pitch black clouds were moving towards us. For each second that passed, the wall of darkness grew closer. It was what had terrified James and what had killed the others. "Sheriff, we need to move," I said as I tried to comfort James. I turned around and noticed that the same darkness had occupied the horizon behind us. By the time we'd picked James up, the darkness had enveloped the entire town, shrinking by each second passed. It had already killed most of the police force, and I was starting to fear by the time we got back into town, there wouldn't be anyone left. I don't want to die. I don't want to die," James kept repeating as he sat panicked in the back seat, the shadow inching its way towards town, while we sped down the road in a desperate attempt to reach safety before it was too late. James was in shock, and while I could have given him a few words of comfort, I sensed that he needed something swiftly to bring him back to reality. Without warning, I turned around and slapped him firmly on his cheek. He immediately snapped back to attention. "What was that for?" he asked, voice still shaky, but at least he was focused. "Need to break you away from the hysteria. Crude method, I know, but it worked, didn't it?" He nodded, still shook but thankful. I peeked out through the back window of our speeding car, watching as the darkness grew even closer at an accelerated pace. "This hasn't happened here before, right?" I asked, half-stated. Riley didn't even respond. His eyes were fixed on the road, his hands grasping the steering wheel in a mix of panic and determination. Just as town came into view, a massive wall of darkness shot into the road, cutting our lane off completely. "Watch out!" James yelled, but it was futile. Riley swerved away from the darkness, onto the other lane, causing the car to spin uncontrollably before putting us in an abrupt stop only a few feet away from the dark. No, keep driving!" James yelled as the shadow started to envelop the car. Small tendrils slithered out through the cracks of the window, wrapping around James. "Oh God, help me!" Before I could try to pull him away, the tendrils dug their way into his chest and abdomen. His blood-curdling screams of agony quickly faded as his throat were filled with blood, and within seconds, he could do little but writhe around hopelessly and whimper in pain. I fumbled around for the flashlight and pointed it at the window. The shadow immediately retreated back out, retracting from the light. "The headlights!" I yelled. Riley had already reached out to turn on the high beams. The bright light shoved the shadows away, just long enough for us to make a quick escape. "James, are you all right?" I asked. He didn't respond. He just sat motionless in his seat, eyes wide open and lifeless. "James?" Riley chimed in. He's dead," I said as I checked his pulse. I thought about performing CPR, but his abdomen and chest seemed sunken in, as if he'd simply been hollowed out by the shadow. With no time to stop, we let James' corpse sit there while we made our way into town. By the time we drove past the first neighborhoods, the darkness had formed all around town, leaving nothing but a tiny opening of light as the void surrounded us. In the center, we were met by a small group of survivors. They'd pulled up a perimeter of bonfires and powerful searchlights. Though it seemed to keep the shadows at bay, slivers of darkness still tried to absorb the light, dimming it second by second. We stopped the car and bolted out, leaving James' lifeless body behind. An older man who I recognized as the nameless driver met us with a strong flashlight and gestured for us to follow. "George, thank God. How many people made it?" Riley asked. "We got about a dozen people setting up a barrier, while the rest are scavenging for supplies. But we ain't got long. We need to get inside the station," he said. It was a chaotic retreat back to the sheriff's department. Though it wasn't the safest place to be, it was the only building not yet consumed by the dark. As we ran inside the building, something had emerged from the edge of the shadow wall, just looming on the border. "What's that?" asked Riley. It was one of the things I'd seen wandering the dark, the beings that had kept me in the pantry for weeks. "It's them! It's the creatures I saw!" I yelled in a panic. George and Riley both instinctively put their flashlights towards it, and the shadow quickly retreated back to the dark. But before it did, the true horrific nature of it revealed itself. They weren't shadows, but mangled messes of flesh and human organs, held together by some unseen force. It was as if someone had created poor reconstruction of a person, having nothing more than guts and muscle to work with. "What the hell are those things?" Riley asked with a trembling voice. "I don't know, but let's keep them the fuck away." We mounted a few searchlights on the outside of the building and lit a few fires before barricading the doors to the station. "How long till the dark goes away?" I asked, knowing in my heart what the answer would be. "I don't think it will. Not this time," George said quietly. The darkness kept growing closer, slowly consuming the light and breaking through our barricade. "Is there any way out of town?" I asked. "Only the main road, but it doesn't matter. We can't leave this place." "Do you have any better suggestions?" I asked. "It's only a matter of time before they break through, and once they do, we're all gonna die." Riley kept quiet for a moment while he pondered his response. The others had collected any weapons and lights they could find to keep the shadows at bay, but it could do little more than buy us a few hours. Though we had an overabundance of food and ammunition, electricity was a scarce source. "How long can we keep this place running?" Riley asked. "Without anyone to run the power stations, we have about 12 hours, George responded. "Sorry, Sheriff. I think this is it for us." I looked at him in disbelief that he'd given up so easily without a fight. "No, we can't just give up. Listen, I saw at least 3 patrol cars outside. We could mount lights on them, and at least attempt to escape," I argued. They looked at me without saying a word. There was something they weren't telling me, a reason they were so willing to just surrender. "We can't leave," Riley finally said. "Why the fuck not?" "Since you got to Tenebris, you seen any children?" he asked. The population had seemed to be on the older side, even though I'd only been there for a day. Before the darkness first arrived, I hadn't seen any kids, nor schools, kindergartens, or even families. Riley sighed. 50 years ago, we had our first bout with the darkness. At first, it was nothing more than an oddity we couldn't explain. Something we just accepted as a weird phenomenon. And then people started disappearing, always in the dark, never to be found again. He trailed off. A shadow was heard from outside, jolting us all to attention. Through the window, we could see a few glimmers of light vanishing as one of the searchlights broke down. Time was running out. Of course, once we were hit with the horrors that lurked in the dark, people tried to leave. The thing is that something had happened to the population here. Those that were born here, those that spent too much time in town, they became bound to the place, finding themselves physically incapable of leaving. Those that ignored their instincts, those who tried to leave anyway, simply vanished, without a trace. "And the kids?" I asked. Eventually, we decided to just stop bringing more people into this nightmare. The last child was born 20 years ago. He was my son. As he finished that last sentence, I had a mixed feeling of anger and pity. "Why didn't you ask for help?" "Trust me, we tried, but who would believe us? We brought in detectives from different cities, hoping they'd see the darkness, that they'd finally help us. But no one ever did until you came." Another shatter sounded outside, as broken glass fell to the ground, and more of the flesh-bound shadows emerged from the dark. So what, that's it? You're just gonna give up?" I asked. After an uncomfortably long amount of time, George finally spoke up. "Sheriff, how about the pillar?" he asked. "Don't be ridiculous," Riley shot back. "Wait, what pillar?" I joined in. "It's the source of their darkness." "George, This isn't time for one of your stories. Don't. I understand your trepidation going in there, Sheriff, but we ain't got any other options. You don't even know where it is. No one does, Riley said. No, but I know where my father, my brother, and your son were last seen. I'll lead the search, but I can't do it alone. By then, everyone had fallen completely silent. As confused as I was, I felt a hint of hope awakening within me. What exactly are we gonna do? I asked. Riley turned to me and sighed. We're going to destroy the darkness.